Welcome to the Roar Rugby League Podcast. I'm Meehall Wood, and as we gear up for the big kickoff in the NRL, I thought we should all get in shape. We've trained the house down, we've blown off all the cobwebs in the trials, and we've had our first taste of proper rugby league in Vegas. Now it's time for the week to week of the NRL to begin. Now, everyone knows that the NRL is a marathon, not a sprint, so who better to speak to than an ultra marathon runner with the science to back it up? Dr David Lipman is a medical doctor, a strength and conditioning expert with experience across league, union, and other sports. He provides specialist coaching to professional athletes on how to prepare their bodies for the rigors of elite sport. He's coached some of the best players in the world, and given that he also coached me, some of the worst. And now he works in sports tech and produces content that delves into the science behind elite fitness performance. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. David Lipman.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you again, mate. It's been a while.
Yeah, well, you see, I think I can teach the world on how to play halfback in touch footy once you bring in the contact and the running around. Not for me. I apologise for all of my weaknesses as a player, but, you know, the Dutch Rugby League competition isn't for everybody.
I was actually going to say, you actually helped us a lot from a judo aspect. So you could be credited to bringing the wrestle to the Amsterdam Cobras.
Yeah, I'm the Craig Bellamy of Dutch Rugby League. Dude, there you go. I'm better than most rugby league players at judo. I'll give them that. I'm not better than the rugby league, unfortunately. So the first question, right? We want to talk about fitness in the NRL, strength and conditioning. What it is that I kind of the working title for this was what are rugby league players fit, and if so, how are they fit? Because I think it's a really unique kind of fitness to play rugby league, which I think is probably quite unlike a lot of sports because you kind of have to be the close-up fitness of a MMA fighter or a boxer in terms of the short efforts in contact, and then there's the long efforts of doing shuttle runs for 80 minutes, and then there's the big sprints across different positions. And I guess the first question is a bit dumb, but it's something I think of quite a lot, is like just how fit are rugby league players in general?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really good question to start with, and a really important one to consider is, like, firstly, what is fitness? And it's, you know, there's all these domains of fitness. We won't go into it. It's not a university lecture, but when people think of fitness, they tend to think about aerobic endurance is generally what people think about. Like, someone's fit if they run a marathon, but they don't think the rugby players are fit or whatever. So what I'd say is you've done a good job there to preface it, which is fitness has many domains, and these guys are asked to perform across many of them. And the real challenge in league is the aerobic capacity that's required to run, as you say, repeatedly, retreating back for each set or each tackle and going forward again, doing that for 80 minutes with, you know, yes, okay, the modern game, interchanges, and we've got these big forward packs, and, you know, we have only one utility on the bench or whatever, like, sure, but still, nonetheless, that's still a lot of aerobic capacity required in comparison to the closest other sport, which is rugby union. If you look at the rugby union forwards, outside of the back rowers, they're not even close to the rugby league guys. But at the same time, as a sport, like, the diversity of player requirements in league is a lot more homogenous than most sports positionally, just because of everybody's kind of got to be fit enough. Yes, there's some different sizes, but they're a lot more homogenous. But your point's well made. These guys need to be conditioned to sprint fast, have good acceleration, good change of direction, and that's everybody now. There's no more, you know, I mean, maybe some of you hit up forwards don't need the agility that some of the other guys do, but generally they do. They're going to have the skill, right? And the skill level's high in rugby league. There's no question about that. They need to be able to do the wrestle, as you said, and be conditioned for that. And then they've got to be able to carry on for 80 minutes. So the interesting thing, if you dig into the research, is, and everyone will agree with this, which is, as the season progresses in terms of rounds versus finals, or sort of NRL competition versus Origin or internationals, intensity goes up and fitness requirements go up. And yet these guys aren't really prepared for that. They kind of just get dropped into it, and you just kind of have to be ready for it and do it on the day, but they're not really prepared for that physically. And the other really interesting and ironic bit is that the fittest these guys will be from, like, a objective measurement standpoint is preseason, and where they need to be fittest is end of season, Origin, etc. So you get progressively less objectively fit, so to speak, whatever fitness is, but more match ready. And anybody who's played will agree, like, the biggest preseason doesn't really help you compared to 2-3 weeks of footy, because just by the virtue of it, the specificity of it just can't be there. You can't play a game of footy in preparation. I mean, even trials are not quite the same because the intensity is different. So How fit are they? Very is the answer. And the best way to sort of think about that is looking at some numbers and comparing them. So if you look at things like a standard test in the rugby league is a 1,200 meter shuttle run for time. And these guys are getting mid to low 4 minutes for 1,200 meters, which is pretty quick. It's not, there's no marathon runners who think that that's great, but there's no marathon runners who are 100 kilos, or not many anyway. So suffice to say, these guys are quick and would be up there with some of the best hybrid athletes in the world, I'd say.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the example I always use, right, is that if you go to watch South Sydney train, right, at the end of every session, they'll link arms and they'll just walk up the field. And it's like a team bonding thing that they do. But often they'll have the shirts off, and you'd look at like Latrell Mitchell or Alex Johnson, who'd be some of them. Latrell plays fullback, which I would say is probably the fittest position on the field. Johnson plays on the wing, which is a speed position. And they've got little guts. Like they're not completely ripped. Whereas if you watch just, players 1 to 11 on the soccer team would be completely ripped. And they're not ripped because they don't need to be, because it's not a core requirement to be like absolutely shredded, because you need to carry a bit of that weight. And I guess that's the challenge as an S&C person, is that you need to get them as fit as possible whilst maintaining a body weight that allows them to compete, because no amount of wrestling skill overcomes the fact if Tom Burgess is 120 kilos and you're, Sam Walker would be one of the smaller ones. He's about 80 kilos. A 40 kilo weight difference. Doesn't matter how good you are at jiu-jitsu if someone's 40 kilos heavier than you, right? You need to keep that. And that's an extreme example, but if you're Latrell and your game is both speed and power, you can't just be completely ripped all the time, because you're going to end up not heavy enough and not having that bulk to kind of burst through when you need to burst through in that real collision moment. But then you need to be fit enough to then pull away from, if you do get through, to still be able to make it to the other end of the field. And from a strength and conditioning perspective, how do you design it so that you can keep that? Because that's not, I would imagine, a normal thing in the strength and conditioning world to have to deal with.
Yeah, I think your point around sort of size and momentum and physics effectively is what you're talking about, right? Which is just mass is, force is undefeated, physics is undefeated. So yeah, for sure. I think you're spot on there with respect to like carrying a bit of extra. And that's player specific a little bit as well. You'll see there's some guys who are lean, and some of them are probably playing above their weight. Maybe some of the hit up forwards played a different position when they were younger and now are trying to put on some weight, and maybe they're a bit leaner because it's hard for them to maintain weight. Whereas someone like Latrell is probably always battling a little bit to be like, he's probably got some people in his ear like, hey mate, you need to lose a bit a lot of the time. And some of that's positional, some of that's natural body habitus, some of that's, calories that they absorb versus not. There's certainly some stories I've heard about people having to keep some extra fat on as a bit of a cushion to prevent things like corks. And look, I don't know how much truth there is to that physiologically. I can't speak to it and make some intrinsic sense, but like, yeah, whatever, who knows? But I can certainly understand that. From a ability to tolerate training load, having caloric stores is helpful as well. If you're going to do a lot of training and you want to run very lean, you have to match that output very closely or you're going to really struggle. So there is some advantage to being that touch heavier. And I hear a lot of forwards like holding this up to the S&C coaches going, yeah. Like, listen, I need to be a bit heavier. I'm talking about like, a couple of percent here. I'm not talking about, turning up with a beer gut and then, starting preseason there. So there is some advantage there. In terms of how hard is it? I mean, it's why you get into these sports. Like, you talk to the guys who are in the NRL, they love this stuff. They love the complexity of it because to some degree, it's actually quite easy to prepare people for, a more simple sport in terms of what's required. The complex nature of having to prepare guys for somebody, this sort of hybrid athlete is where the challenge comes. It's where the beauty of it is. And so it's where the guys enjoy it. So, I mean, everybody will be different in terms of their approach. So as a coach, in terms of how they like to do this. And that's based, generally, you would hope that what comes down is like the coach talks to them about the game plan. Like, this is how we want to play the game. Offloading, attack, defensive minded, whatever, right? These are the principles we want to play off. Based on that, we need to hit these sort of KPIs, and then you prepare the team for that. But then within that, you individualize to the person. So you might say, hey, Latrell, we need you to do a bit of extra conditioning, but, take another person, maybe Damien Cook, hey, we need to keep your speed up. We need you out of dummy half. So we need to actually work on your first 10 meters, and we need you to be a bit more physical because of all the contact you're going to take. So we actually need to bulk you up a little bit. So there'll be some individual nuance within a team paradigm as well. And then, you just try and maintain it. But generally the principles would be the stuff that's hardest to develop is power, which is, pure power. So it's speed times, it's strength times speed. That's like the equation for it. So it's that stuff, then strength, then size, which is hard to keep on, especially as you start the running. And the running comes kind of all the way through, but it's your last priority because it's the easiest to develop that aerobic ability. And then, of course, skill components are always through there. And that's kind of partially the realm of S&C. I'm sure like some S&Cs have got more input than others in that respect. And they'll often try and layer in conditioning with aspects of skill development. So they'll play small-sided games or something like that where there's a conditioning component, but also there's a skill component to that. And then, that sort of layers through the season. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I'm thinking of a conversation that I had. It's great. It used to be great going to Souths because they trained at Redfern Oval, which is close to my house. And I could just sort of go in and you chat to the players and talk about this. And you could watch the whole training session, which isn't always possible with other teams. But I had this conversation as well with Lockie Ilias where coming into grade, he hadn't played football because of COVID, because they cancelled the second grade. He played 3 games in 2 years or something like that. And I always think of him and Sam Walker being not the same size, but roughly the same size. And if you look at them now, Lockie's got so much bigger, like because they've clearly said to him, like, this is the bit that you're going to struggle with in elite football, is that it's you can batter the lower grades based on skill and speed and stuff like that, and then it's when you've got to do that contact at speed over and over again. And if you look, and I remember him, maybe it was the start of last season, just saying how difficult it was because he had to keep his weight up and he was just eat. Whereas at the same time, you could go to Manly training and Josh Schuster, who was trying to get from back row to play 6, he was going through the opposite problem, and he ended up, they called him out publicly early in the season for a lack of conditioning because and I wonder how much of that is to do with the fact that he was being told to lose weight at the same time, which is obviously going to affect your conditioning. And just, it is such a specific thing in terms of when some people, if you're trying to put on weight, and I know this is someone who's been trying to put on weight for about 10 years, but like, it's really hard to eat that much and still like you struggle to then do the physical part because you're so full and you're constantly worrying about it. And I can imagine from the other side, it's the same. And it's almost part of the sports psychology job as well, right? To try and you've got to keep guys engaged. And maybe the skill part comes into that where you're trying to make it less like, if you told Josh Schuster to go and do laps of Brookvale Oval, like he probably wouldn't be enormously pleased about it whereas if you told him to go play touch footy for an hour, like he'd probably have a great time and he wouldn't even notice that he was burning all the calories. So I wonder from that perspective, how much it is about what, sort of the politics of the possible, like what you can actually achieve, bearing in mind that these guys have to be at their elite of performance once a week for 25 weeks in a row. Yeah,
you're spot on. Like looking at the Lockley and Ilias example you gave, the other thing to remember with him is he didn't play footy, so he didn't actually need to be that conditioned. So it's actually quite easy for him to put on weight compared to if he had to play seasons, because he's not bumped and bruised. He's not struggling from that little ding or that cork or that sore shoulder, that stinger he got. So he's fresher, so he can train harder, but he's also not got the output of training for 42 times a week and playing the game on the weekend because he can't. So it's actually almost advantaged him in terms of putting on that weight to do that. And it's classic periodization, but you just don't have that luxury with most guys. And if you look at the AFL, they do this pretty well with their rookies, is they actually don't have full running loads for quite a while, like 2-3 years in, because they can't, because the running loads are so high. These guys aren't prepared for it, which goes to kind of what you're talking about, which is to prepare someone for a season. One of the ways you can ensure failure as an S&C coach and ensure losing your job is injuring people or having a bunch of soft tissue injuries. Like you have a bunch of hamstrings, you have a bunch of Achilles or something like that, and your chances of having your job the next year are pretty low. Of course, some of this is random and it's not all controllable, but you need to be really careful with that. And part of that is appropriate loading in the preseason to make sure they've got enough load tolerance for the season. Part of it's also like appropriate loading going into that preseason and loading that preseason appropriately as they go along. But then it makes it really hard to have high running loads in the preseason and bulk guys up, right? So you have this real challenge. You'll often have people who are split into, you hear this in preseasons a lot of the time, and it'll depend on the S&C coach, but there'll often be a bunch of guys who are like the fat club, so to speak, and they'll be like trying to lose weight. They'll do extra conditioning. there'll be guys who are pretty young, the Sam Walkers, etc., who will be trying to bulk up, and they'll probably do a little bit less running because they're often quite fit. They're pretty young blokes. They're coming into the team. They probably play positions like, pivot positions, things like that, where conditioning is super important, but you're not having the same repeated efforts as you are in, say, the front row.
Speaking as a former halfback, you're trying to avoid contact.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're Sam Walker, you're trying to skive out on the wing.
Yeah, and you're not, in terms of your repeated high speed efforts, they're not there because the first couple of hit ups, you're not really that involved. And if you are, it's really to dish the ball. So you're not having this high speed in attack or this repeated efforts in attack. Now, of course, in defense, you still have the repeated efforts, but not so much in attack. So they can usually get away with it. They're trying to bulk up. And then there's sort of the more everybody else in the middle who are kind of, they've been playing NRL for a while. They're probably big enough, almost, or thereabouts. You want to put a couple of kilos on them, not too much, but they're not too overweight. That's sort of your general. And they come in and it's like, all right, well, you're kind of doing the base. And then we've got the extra conditioning or the extra hypertrophy work and maybe a little bit less conditioning to try and sort of bulk them up. And then, as I said, there's always going to be individualization around certain things you need them to work on. And then probably some like rehab stuff. Because, the other thing to remember is like all these guys are carrying injuries from whatever age group, right? They've been carrying injuries for however long. So, like I remember Dane Gagai, I worked with him when he was at school, in high school, not too much, but I did a little bit with him. And he had a couple of shoulder injuries, say, coming out of school. And so you'd be doing extra work with him because you want him to be able to sustain that contact, particularly as a young bloke who's quite small. The other one that comes to mind is Benji Marshall. When he came into the league, he had repeated shoulder issues because he just didn't have the bulk to hold that, and his structural integrity wasn't there to play high level. So probably with Benji for the first couple of years, it's like, actually, mate, we're going to keep you quick and keep you deceptive, but let's just get you in the gym and just bulk you up, because that's what's going to help you have a career. Because without that, you've got not a lot of chance. If you have these shoulder dislocations every year, A, you're not going to play much. B, then the best predictor of injury is previous injury. So you're not going to be conditioned. When you come back, you're going to have a harder time getting up to speed, but also you're not playing, you're not getting better and all those things. So it's this bit of a sort of knock-on effect you're trying to avoid.
Yeah, I was just thinking there of obviously being a Manly supporter, I see what Daly Cherry Evans looks like now, and you think this guy is so, every bit of him is geared to play rugby league, right? Yep. And I think if he had never touched the footy, if he grew up in, somewhere that doesn't play, if he grew up in Canada, right, no rugby of any kind at all, he would probably be about my size, I reckon. But because he's been a footy player since he was 12 or whatever, he's been bulking to the point where, when he hits 25, 26, he probably doesn't need to anymore. Like, he's as maximally bulked as he could be while still being able to, run around. And this is so why everybody jokes about how big his neck is. And I know living in Manly that you see Michael Hooper walking around as well, who's kind of the same thing, where he's like as big as he could possibly be. And even after playing, he still just sort of is that size now. And I wonder, the story I always think of in this is Herbie Farnworth was, when we went back for the World Cup, all the English journals obviously don't get to speak to him as frequently. We're like, oh, tell us about how you played for Man United. And he was so exasperated at it because he was like, have you seen the size of me? Like, the chances of me ever playing for Man United, given that I'm now 105 kilos and I'd be the biggest player in the Premier League by a distance. And part of that is that he is fully ripped. Like, he could not be smaller than he is in terms of weight wise. He could easily go, and if he'd have been told 2 years ago, you're going to play for the Dolphins in the back row, he could have done it. Or someone like Isaiah Yeo, who did do that. He went from playing centres to playing lock. And I think of a lot of this, it seems to be like, we think there isn't that much difference in positions, but you realize that these guys have been training like that with S&C guys say this is where you need to hit in 5 years' time compared to now. And I wonder, is that, as a coach, you're thinking of what can we do for this game on the weekend? What can we do so that they fit for Origin and for finals, but also so that you're the best player you can possibly be, so we don't have to do this work in 3 years' time?
Yeah, it's always hard in sport, and this goes across sports. I'm an NFL fan as well. I support the Steelers. We've had the same coach for 17 years. Good organizations have stability and bad organizations don't. And sometimes it's hard to know, sometimes you don't have control over this stuff, but stability is helpful for these exact reasons, which is if you have the same coach, you generally have a similar game plan. You have similar constraints you're trying to work with. You have similar staff. So therefore people see things similarly and you can develop similarly. You get the same messages to guys. They train the same similar ways. so they can adapt better, but you can also have longer term plans. The surefire way to ensure that you really struggle to see long-term development is chop and change all the time. So a level of stability and consistency is really, really important. And if you see clubs that are doing better historically for long periods of time, it's generally through aspects of stability. The Roosters come to mind at the moment. They've got a lot of stability in that organization based on support staff, coaches, etc., and player group, and therefore development of those players as well. Now, of course, there's some change and whatever else, but it's really easy to turn to kids who are in your academies, your 16s, your 18s, and say, listen, this is what we need in 5 years. If you're pretty confident, we'll still be here. And that's sort of helpful to them. And you can start to have those plans. You can talk to Sam Walker and say, listen, we want to bulk you up, but it's a 5-year plan. We're not going to try and change you too much now. We want you to come in, play a bit. We're going to put you back. And you can put him back to reserve grade and talk to him about that development because it's a long-term view and he's confident because you're still going to be there.
Yeah, I'm also just on something that you mentioned before there in terms of the season length. Yep. You want your guys to be fit at the end of the year, but you basically, one of the things that you hear if you talk to people, and it's not just in rugby league, is that basically you could set now what the plan is for the grand final, right?
Yep.
Because that's what they spend. We think of them. Footy starts in March and it ends in October, right? But if you're a footy player, footy starts in November and ends in October. Because if you're any good, it ends in October. If you're the Tigers, it might not get that far. But so they have been working for almost as long as the season is in pre-season, and that is fitness and tactics and all this stuff. So that the idea that when you hit the end, you don't need to think about it. It's just second nature to you, and that's what works in terms of both on the field tactics and in terms of off the field fitness. And during the week to week of the season, it is just prehab. Like you're not trying to reinvent. If you're any good at it, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel in July because it's too late. You're only doing that because you've already lost. So I wonder, from a fitness perspective, you say you want to be fittest in October, but you will be fittest now. How do you have to almost overshoot fitness now, so knowing that it's going to tail off as the season goes on?
Yeah, so I think one thing with fitness, like when I was talking about that, it's very much objective. So like your 1200 meter time, for instance, but your actual ability to display fitness on the field, so your ability to play 80 minutes of football will increase across the season. So your specific preparedness will increase to some degree, with the exception of injury and fatigue and these things, right? Like the Origin players are not fittest or most able to play the day after, 2 days after Origin when they're back up on Friday night for their team. But let's say after a bye round, you're probably more prepared to play a game of footy than you are at the end of the preseason because you've played some, you're battle hardened, all those things, you're used to the contact and that. So you'll bounce back better. So you're certainly more specifically prepared, maybe not as generally prepared, but depending on your age and your training age, which is a key metric here. So training age is something, your age is whatever it is, whatever your birth certificate says or doesn't say in some cases. And then you've got training age, which is kind of very specific to, say, rugby league. So you might be new to rugby league, so you have a low training age, someone who's transferred sports. You might also be new to the gym, so you have a low training age in the gym. So the earlier you are, the easier it is to see progress. We've all been there, be the newbie in the gym and, go in there, sniff the air, and all of a sudden you get stronger. So there's certainly a component of this. Someone like Sam Walker probably does make strength gains or maybe size gains across the season because he can. He's pretty, he's early in his career compared to somebody like, we talked about off air before, Jared Wario-Hargreaves. Like he's probably maintaining at best, maybe losing a bit across the season. Maybe he's losing year to year because he's getting a little bit older as well. But you certainly want that. You want to try and maintain things in the season, but you certainly, as you alluded to, are preparing for what they call worst case scenario. So yes, you're overshooting, but you're also preparing for overtime in a grand final. You're not preparing for, you're going to play 30 minutes in round one because you're a bench forward. We're playing no, we got injuries and you're going to play 80 minutes in the final. Plus we got overtime. So you're going to be prepared for that. And a lot of that's load tolerance. So how many tackles can you make a game? What do we estimate it's going to be if we have to play overtime? How many meters can you run? How many high-speed meters can you run? How many high-speed involvements can you run? Repeated efforts, like all those things. Or if you're preparing for Origin, you're talking about repeated high-speed or high-intensity efforts. Like that's going to be much higher. So you're looking for, 1.5 times what you're anticipating in an NRL round, perhaps. So that's how the sort of paradigm they use is this worst case scenario, so that you're ready for that. And that's often why you'll see, to some degree, some of the teams, but definitely the guys who don't get as many minutes will often go do extras after the game. I don't know if you've seen this, if you've hung around, but there's a couple of guys who, maybe it's your utility back on the bench goes and does some like sprints afterwards and some running, because that way he at least gets like a top up of fitness and then is kind of aligned with everybody else and goes and does the recovery the next day.
Yeah, you do see. I always notice it at Manly, because when you do the press conferences, you come back to the media box and you just, they're cleaning up the stadium and stuff like that, and there'll be like Ben Trebojevic or somebody will be out doing intervals in the like in the 20-meter zone, because he's only played 20 minutes.
Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting there that you I'm thinking of how they have to prepare for, to do X amount of work, right? So at time of recording, right, we've just had the team list for Vegas, and Spencer Laniu has been named to start for the Roosters, having only ever played 30 minutes a game for the Panthers. Obviously, he's going to have to play more than 30 minutes if he's starting the game. So the Roosters will then have to know, okay, so we think his load tolerance is in, of course, they'll have been telling him since November, you're going to start round one, because they know that Jared's suspended. Yeah. Or like, this is the sort of player we want you to be, which is different to what you had to be at the Panthers.
Yeah.
And so I wondered where the data comes into this as well, because if you watch games now, everybody's got the little chip in the back of their shirts. Yep. And I often think, as a stats guy, I'm looking at it going, what's the guy with the laptop actually looking at? Is he looking at, complex data modeling of tactics? And it's like, no, he's just looking at what the readouts are from this thing in the back of the jumper, so they know when to sub people. And you can take, I would imagine, a preseason, say we want Spencer Laniu to hit this many meters, this many tackles in this amount of time, and you can go, okay, we can train to that. And that will be different to Jake Trebojevic, who's going to play for 70 minutes and make that many tackles, but we actually don't need him to make that many meters, or we think he's better just moving the ball along. I wonder, how can you give us an insight on how you do that with two guys who essentially play the same position but have totally different roles and what that looks like?
Yeah. So just because they play the same position doesn't mean they're prepared the same, as you've alluded to. And so as a result, perhaps in a conditioning game in the preseason, you actually split them. So despite being perhaps in competition with each other, perhaps the same position or whatever, you'd split them up and you'd play, this is how I would do it. And I'm sure there's some people who'd say like, I'd take a different approach, and that's why there are different NRL coaches. And to be clear, I've never worked in the NRL and not even in the QRL. So like, if you want to throw any stones, by all means do it. But I certainly have some insight into, for instance, the Dutch Rugby Union and how they did some of this preparedness. And what they did was they looked at match constraints from the competition they were in, which is roughly, what are people hitting in these positions from a high-speed running, number of tackles, number of high-speed involvements. So in rugby league, you'd look at, for front rower, you'd look at number of hit-ups in a game and roughly how many minutes you'd expect them to play, what their high-speed running distance is, number of accelerations, number of decelerations, number of tackles, those sort of things. Now you've got a quantification of roughly what you want him to do. So you're going to say, okay, Spencer's going to play roughly 60 minutes. And in that 60 minutes, he's going to do X amount of work, which means that's roughly this amount of work per minute. Now let's get him ready for that. And so you'd be building small-sided games that force him to do that. So you'd create the size of the field and you'd create the number of players and the rules of the game around allowing him to then have to do that in the game. And you'd slowly increase that exposure over time. So it might be that, let's say it needs to be one tackle, one hit up, 10 meters of high-speed running and something else in each minute or each 5-minute block. And you would build that from, say, a 5-minute block to a 10-minute block to a 20-minute block over the preseason in a similar game. And I would take the games approach for the reasons you mentioned before, which is generally the guys enjoy it a bit more. And yes, this is their job, but also we all work a little bit better when we enjoy it a little bit more. But it's also a bit more specific. There's decision-making components, and you start to see where he's fatiguing, because you're looking, part of fatigue, and the reason fatigue is a problem is skill execution gets worse and decision-making gets worse. And you want to stress test that as well, as like, when's this guy actually breaking a little bit? So to use an example from rugby union, and apologies to go there and swap sports, but I'm sure it's helpful anyway, that South African rugby union team have this bomb squad concept, which basically like in interchange, they change everybody and then, it's ruining rugby union or whatever. But when they change people is when they notice their number of involvements decreases. So they have a threshold and they're like, when old mate's involvement drops below this, he's coming. I don't care what time of the game that is. He's too tired. He's done enough by that stage. We're getting him off. And then they replace him there. And I'm sure that's what the stats guy is doing in rugby league as well, which is, how's so-and-so looking? Well, he's walking a bit. Okay. Is he just trying to recover a bit? Let's see how he goes. Oh, now he's actually taking a couple of hit-ups that set. Okay. Let's see how he goes. He's walking that off. In the next set, how's he doing? Probably more in defense as well, because it's going to show a lot more in defense whether you're struggling. Like, are you getting back on side? How's your first couple of steps? How are you looking? How's body language? All those sort of things. And, are they targeting you as well? Because, a good hooker and a good halfback will target players, particularly key players, to try and tire them out.
Yeah, it's interesting because I won't know who it was, but there was a coach who I assumed that this is what they did, and then you could just hear through the wall of the media box where they were going, "Get him off, get him off."
Yeah,
and it was nothing to do with how skilled, how tired they were. I just, it was to do with they dropped the ball once or whatever. And I was like, sure, there's got to be more science to this. And I was speaking to obviously that was a coach in a bad team, and coaching a good team told me a similar thing, which was, sort of the other end of it, which was like, he could tell you the interchange plan now, pretty much before the game started. He could say pretty much within, some there's injuries and there's
of course
little mishaps and whatever, but by and large, this is what we're going to do, because we do it every week, you know. And it's something that I think in rugby league, which is, I'd say, the weakest of weak link sports. Like, you're only as good in rugby league as your worst player. Like, if you like basketball, for example, you can have 4 guys on LeBron and you'll go all right. Like, because LeBron's so much, you can guarantee on him or Steph Curry or whoever to score X amount of points. Whereas in rugby league, it doesn't matter if you have Nathan Cleary, if you've got me playing standoff, because guess where the other team's going to run, So I think that's, especially with forwards, this must be something that they really think about, because you can take hit-ups. Hit-ups is run the ball forwards. You might not take effective ones.
Exactly.
But like, if the other team notices, and I think of a game last year between Para and the Sharks where Jermaine Hopgood was unbelievable for 38 minutes of the first half, but he didn't get subbed. And it was his second, maybe a third game of NRL for Para. And he was good. And Wyn Kennedy just ran straight past him. And I thought, that's not his fault. Like, that's the person who should have seen it and should have subbed him's fault. And that's something that in round 3 was a problem. But what in round, by round 20, it wasn't a problem, because he got that. The reps in the tank, as they always say, the reps.
Yeah. And this is, like, you can play on this tactically, right? Cameron Smith used to be really good at that. He'd point people out and really target them. And if you're thinking about it, there are only a couple of people you'd want to target. You want to target the weakest link, because you think that's where you're going to score. You're going to target their strongest attacking player to try and tire him out so that he doesn't want to attack much. Or you're going to target somebody key that you're really worried about. So Damien Cook's a good example. Yes, he's very fit, but I'd be running at him a lot to try and tire him out so that he's not as quick off the mark when he does take his dummy half scoot, because that's such a key weapon for the Rabbitohs. I'd be like, all right, we just got to run at him and do everything we can there to try and target him repeatedly in sets of 6, take 2-3 at him every time. Yeah,
I'm thinking of, I know, because I wrote an analysis prior to one of the prelims last year about Melbourne v Penrith. And there was a bit where Melbourne really rattled Penrith, and they scored the perfect try. Penrith battered them in the end, but there was a period where they really rattled them, and there was a try. I think it was a Safa Solomona scored it, but Harry Grant he made Jerome Luai make 4 tackles in a set, and then the last play of it was quite a simple try, but it was because they'd gone hit to the guy they thought, this is, he's the weak link. I think Nathan Cleary might not have been playing, so they clearly had said, if you can stop Luai, you'll stop the rest of them. It didn't work in the end, but you could see it, and it was almost like the S&C people would have been sat there cheering, saying, "We scored that try because we've picked out that this is the way to do it." It's something you mentioned before, obviously, about the sort of the age profile of players as well. And I know this is an area that you've worked in before, but I had an interesting conversation also with Tyson Frizzell about this, where he said that at his age now, as a veteran, I'm sure you dealing with Dane Gagai when he was younger compared to now, that all of his stuff was just keeping going. Just the fact that he was avoiding injury and being able to be on the field, and he didn't actually need really anything more than that. And I wonder, across the lifespan of an athlete, how much does that change in terms of aerobic capacity? And like, there's almost a mental part that they know what it's like to play 25 games in the NRL, whereas a guy playing his first game has got no idea of that.
Yeah, I think so. One aspect you're talking about is ownership and player ownership there. And it's something that Dan Baker from the Broncos was a really big ad. I don't know where Dan is now. I don't think he's with the Broncos anymore, but he was one of the greats of S&C in rugby league, was really big on this. Is like, as people progress through, they start to get more ownership over their programs and more ownership of what they did and how they did it. And I think most S&Cs would do that. Is as guys get a little bit older, they get some ownership, and you might go from here's your exact program to like, hey, we need to hit these things, do the exercises that you find the best bang for buck from, to, hey, mate, what do you need to be ready to go this week? And that might be the transition you have over your career with someone like Tyson Frizell, who's towards the end of his career. The other thing to remember is that like adaptation, some of this adaptation is very short term, right? So it's really easy to turn around certain things really quickly. Preseason, famously, guys turn up really unfit and somehow they're fit for round one, like from having done no running because they had they're often young guys, like had an off-season blowout or whatever. Now they're back and they get in shape for season somehow. So some of these things are really quick to adapt and some of them are slower. But one of the things to remember is like there's kind of this 3-4 steps forward across the season, perhaps, and then like a couple of steps back in the off season. But you're never quite back to start for most of these guys. And so you're kind of like progressing all the way along. And probably at Tyson's level, he's probably not gaining a lot over preseason and he's not losing a lot in the off seasons anymore. So he's probably close to his capacity. And what he's accrued over a career probably stays around really well. So he could probably do less in the off season than most and come back in better shape, with the exception of, as we age, our tendons aren't so happy. So, he'd need to keep up enough running load just so that his Achilles doesn't, sort of give him curry during the season, or his knees or whatever. So he probably also knows what he needs by now. Like, he knows what it needs to feel good. And so for a lot of these guys, especially somebody like Tyson, who's had a long career, lots of contact, probably quite a few injuries, maybe not explicit injuries. He's maybe not missed time with an ACL, but he's probably had like a stinger here or there. And, he's got a couple of things. It's kind of like, we're better off keeping this guy fresh so that he can play and then not doing much. And I mean, was it Brett, your fullback from Manly, the Snake.
Oh, Stewart.
Brett Stewart, yeah. He famously wouldn't do a lot of training at all through the week, but he would play on Saturday, right, or Sunday towards the end of his career. And I think that's a classic example of like, this guy's so good. He doesn't just get him to play. If all he can do is play for us, we're good. We're better off with him than we are without him. So it's certainly a component of that. And that doesn't happen for everybody. Let me tell you, like guys who are on, who've had sort of twilight of their career, probably hit up forward, like not as much, but Tyson Frizell's a very good player and still is. And you kind of need him to keep being that. He's a bit of a unicorn. There's probably not too many props who you're doing that with.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the positional difference. So I'm thinking of a conversation I had on to Nico Hines about this, where it was when he'd just gone from playing fullback at Melbourne to playing halfback.
Yep.
And even the demands of defending in the front line. So he was basically trying to explain, I think there might have been a send-off and he'd had to go back to playing fullback. And he was saying, like, you couldn't imagine the difference when even for a guy who I would say looks exactly the same, he's probably not enormously different in weight, but like from having to do the running bit of being a fullback, which unless you go to the stadium, you very rarely see, because they're stood behind the line they're counting the numbers for everybody where to stand. Whereas the halfback, you almost take the set off in defense, because you just get up, get down, make the tackles that run at you, try not to get, try to avoid doing it if possible. And suddenly he had to go back to doing the long sprints. And it's so interesting that you have to try and, especially a guy like him, for example, you want him to be able to make the shuttle runs, but he has to still be able to make that because he's your second fullback. And as soon as somebody goes down, he's in there. And I wonder, how do you prepare a player for that sort of thing, where you're saying we need you to be 90% of this athlete and 10% of the other?
Yeah, I think so. The physiology is pretty similar. That underpins that. Like, of course, long sprints, or like, let's call it, he's probably not sprinting that much at fullback unless he makes a break. Let's call it 70% effort compared to, say, 50% coming up in a line, right? So we're saying he's repeatedly doing 10 meter, 50% efforts versus maybe 2 to 3 70% efforts that are probably 20 to 30 meters at a time in a set, right? That's kind of the difference we're talking about. A lot of that physiology that underpins that is similar. Like, you need a high aerobic capacity, which is your ability to use oxygen and fundamentally burn mostly fat for energy, right? So the better that your capacity to do that, the quicker you'll recover between efforts, the better off you'll be, the faster everything else becomes. And then you need to touch on that top end speed, which is not really about energy systems. That's about the neurology and a little bit of energy system, right? So for these guys, 100-meter sprint, they're probably hitting 10 meters per second. 100 meter for them at game speed with a ball, all that sort of stuff. They're probably running equivalent of like 11 seconds, maybe somewhere in the 11-second region for the 100 meters, despite what Phil Gould says around, fastest man in the world or whatever. Like, so that stuff you kind of need to touch on, but you don't need a lot of that. You can develop that or have it originally and maintain it. So like, I guarantee the Fox isn't doing a ton of sprint work. They don't have a sprint coach down there with him doing tons of sprint work every week. He does enough of that to maintain it, because so much of that is either natural or already developed. And then to maintain that is definitely possible, but it's not the work required to maintain a capacity is much less than the work required to gain it originally, which is also why you can handle, these guys, as I said, they're less conditioned at the end of the season, but it's not significant. It's not like you'd notice it. They're not going from, say, a 4-minute 1200 meter to a 6-minute 1200 meter. We're talking about like low 4-minute to maybe high 4-minute, but their actual ability to repeat their efforts in, say, a tackle situation and wrestle is much better.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I'm just thinking there's one final question, because I know this is what you're doing now in terms of the nutrition stuff as well. Like,
yep.
One of the things that I've noticed in recent years, that I said this because in the Super League they were sponsored by Papa John's Pizza, right? And somebody explained to me that in a post-match environment, a pizza wasn't actually that bad a thing to eat. Like, it had the right fast carbs, fat, some protein from the cheese and pepperoni, whatever. And it got me thinking of, like, because they're unusual athletes, right? They're not, we all think of, if you're going to go and be in the Tour de France, like, you've got to do energy gels and plain rice and chicken and stuff like that.
Yep.
Or I think of, I know Man United footballers used to love Jaffa cakes. They'd worked out the Jaffa cakes had the right, balance of macronutrients,
yep.
whatever. I wonder, from when you're organizing this kind of athlete, which I guess is the same across all sports, but
yep.
how much of it is what you can do on the field and how much of it is the fuel that you put into them? And then sort of as a subsection of that, how much is that stuff that they actually want to eat? Because that, I imagine, is the biggest issue. It's all well and good saying, Sam Walker, we need you to be heavier, go and eat mountains of chicken breast, but he's not going to want to eat that,
Yeah. I had a nutrition lecturer who once said, like, all the theory in the world's great, but if, like, the guy doesn't want to do it, hope. So I think the first thing is, and nutrition staff will tell you this, is kind of, you have this sort of theory and then you have to fit it to the individual, right? So if Sam Walker hates chicken or he's allergic to chicken or whatever, maybe you have to let him eat beef, or maybe you have to let him do something else, right? So it's kind of meet them where they're at and make sure it works for them. And there's a psychological component to that as well. Like, if I told you needed to hit a certain number of grams of carbohydrate before the game, but you've spent your life having bacon and eggs and no toast for breakfast before a game, and then I'm telling you to have 10 slices of bread and some banana and this, like, you're not going to feel good, and psychologically it's going to mess with you. So you kind of got to meet them where they're at to some degree. But most of the guys will be having a fairly high carbohydrate meal in the pre-exercise window, right? Whatever that is. If they're playing a late game, it's probably late lunch, dinner, somewhere there. If it's afternoon game, it's probably at breakfast. They're having quite a bit of carbohydrate, so probably breads, rices, pastas, these sort of things. Probably having some protein as well. And you don't need to overcomplicate it with team sports, because it's not really an energy limiting thing. Like, with the exception of if you play 80 minutes in if you're a back rower that somehow plays 80 minutes and you go to overtime, okay, maybe energy's a problem. And maybe we need to give you something at halftime. Maybe, these guys are drinking some Gatorade on the bench. They're probably having, Alfie Langer running them out some Gatorade or whatever else he has in those bottles. And, at halftime, they're probably having something sugary and those sort of things. So you can top them up a little bit and it probably gets them by. So that's probably what they're doing. In terms of the pizza after the game, like, it's kind of, you need to get something into them. And part of it's less of a challenge perhaps in the NRL, because you kind of, you know where you're going and you kind of know the surrounds and you go there multiple times a year. But if you're traveling, say, internationally, you're playing the Rugby League World Cup or whatever, it's kind of whatever we can get, and we need to be close enough. And things like pizza are really safe and easy, because it's like, oh, this is cooked. We're not going to get food poisoning from it. It's got, as you say, a lot of energy in it, because these guys are energy deficient at the end of it to some degree. So it's like, all right, we got to put some of that back in. You want them to eat. That's the other thing. If you put out a bunch of salad post rugby league match, I don't think too many guys are eating it. So there's all these components, right? Probably the worst thing these guys are doing is beers, and good luck getting the beers out of the rugby league change rooms. So, you know, you kind of got to meet these guys where they're at and concede that perhaps perfect isn't going to be perfect if they don't do it, or perhaps the stress of perfect and all that's not going to be there. But you'll meet some of these guys who'll be, I'm sure Nathan Cleary is very meticulous with what he eats in and around training, in and around games. He probably does have a slice of pizza, but he probably has a protein shake and whatever else as well, just by virtue of who he is and his professionalism and his personality, versus some of the other guys, maybe a front rower who's like, yeah, I care a little bit less about that and it's not as important for me or whatever. So there's certainly a difference between them in that respect as well, I'm sure.
David, it's been illuminating stuff. I hope people have enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed listening to you. I'm going to go away and think of my own nutritional capacities and what I can run. Very little. But brilliant. I think we might have to get you on like later in the season where we can reassess how we deal with this, like going into the finals and stuff like that. Because I think pre-season is such an interesting time to talk about this, because this is what players talk about at this time. Is like they've done all the hard work is done, as they would always say. We've got the reps in, and then now it's sort of maintaining it over the year. So I think that's a good time. We might get you back on later in the year to have a discussion about what that actually means, because this is a subject I could talk about all day, because the idea of this podcast is to get people on to talk who know everything about it, and I can just go, wonder what it'd be like if you got someone and just ask them these 50 questions that I've always thought about this very niche area of rugby league. So thanks so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll speak again about it.
No, thanks for having me. Looking forward to coming back, and looking forward to watching the season.